Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
And so I think that's a big theme that kind of runs through the story is what does it mean for a machine to sort of act like God and make promises? What does that mean for a person of faith? What does it mean for someone who doesn't have faith? There are, I think, some other themes kind of running through it too. Maybe this idea of a machine being more owned by a corporate entity. So this maybe temptation to make Christ sort of in a certain image that might be more palatable to people. So those were some of the themes that I think came out of the story.
My name is Elias Kruger, and I'll be your host. Today's episode is another interview with two contributors to our recently published anthology, Faithful AI, Stories of Hope from 2045, which is now available on Amazon. We covered a range of topics such as authority, digital spirituality, and the limitations of big tech religion.
Appreciate your presence here. We're going to talk about the repairman. Chris, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
First off, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Chris Braconnot. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. By day, I work in technology, and by night, I do creative writing, mostly short fiction. So I work for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office.
Fantastic. So evaluating patents and, making sure that they are truly original and things like that.
Yep,
Awesome.
Yep, that's it, exactly.
I love that. So then you're doing that very analytical work, and then you come home at night and you're like, hey, I'm going to write a story. So it's kind of a different side of your brain. That's great. Tell us a little bit of what Repairman is about, and a little bit about your inspiration. What kind of brought you to write the story?
When ChatGPT came out, like a lot of people, I enjoyed kind of playing with it. One thing that really surprised me was the way that you could ask for a response in a given voice, right? You could ask it to respond as if it were Abraham Lincoln or Edgar Allan Poe. I remember thinking when I was a kid, we used to watch, on New Year's Eve, we used to watch The Ball Drop. That host, we would always joke about how he always looked exactly the same every year. He just never aged. And I remember thinking, like, you could bring back this host with a chatbot. You could create like a video, because we know AI can generate video as well as text through large language models. And so you could sort of have this host, do the ball drop every year in perpetuity.
Right.
And when I saw this notice for a writing contest at the intersection of AI and theology, the first thing that popped in my mind is, oh, you could have a chat Jesus. Mm-hmm. So my story is about a chat Jesus, essentially a kiosk that creates an avatar of Jesus Christ and kind of the implications that might have.
And to give some context, obviously part of the writing context is that we are thinking 20 years out. So obviously you extrapolated some of these technologies and say, hey, in 20 years, we'll figure out how to make this really work. So it's not just typing and a chat Jesus responding to you. It's a full-blown, AR, augmented reality or virtual reality experience. Fantastic. And that becomes the story, Repairman. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of crafting the story? I'm always interested, as a writer myself, I'm always interested in the process. So you had this initial idea and then you started going, and how did you get from there to the final story?
The main character follows a man named Pablo who's responsible for maintaining and repairing these machines. What really started for me was kind of just imagining these kind of goofy or funny scenes. Mm-hmm. What would it be like to have one of these kiosks like at the mall? Or what would it be like if the main character Pablo had to clean off a graffiti, or kind of what would be some of these interactions? And as I kind of drafted some of those, began to fill out his life, thinking a little bit about who was his family be, what would their experiences with religion be. And then the story really clicked into place when the idea of Paulo's mother and some of her health struggles. And the story really becomes, I think, a bit of a crisscross between Paulo's experience with religion and his mother's experience. They kind of start off and end up in kind of different places. That's kind of how it all came together.
Right. That's interesting. So it's not like you sat down and you had all of this, like you had the whole plan and then you wrote it down. It was more like you had these scenes and all of a sudden they started to coalesce and bring you the story, almost as if the story is forming in front of your eyes. Is that an accurate description?
That's it exactly. My process really is, just starting with a character, putting some stuff down and letting that inspire what happens next, and then just revising and revising and reworking until you kind of get to where you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Just as a side note, Chris' story actually ended up winning the contest, so congratulations. That it was a fantastic story. The thing, though, is that this contest wasn't just about writing a nice story. Even though this was very entertaining, very engaging, there was a bit of a request there to really explore the ethical and religious issues. Can you maybe touch on some of the key ethical questions that the story touches on without giving any spoilers, of course?
One of the things I was thinking about the most, I think, as I wrote it, was this question of veracity. What does it mean if a machine, promising or pretending to be Jesus Christ, what does it mean if that machine promises you a miracle? How is that different from if, I don't know, you got a fortune cookie or you just read an affirmation somewhere? And so I think that's a big theme that kind of runs through the story is what does it mean for a machine to sort of act like God and make promises? What does that mean for a person of faith? What does it mean for someone who doesn't have faith? There are, I think, some other themes kind of running through it too. Maybe this idea of a machine being owned by a corporate entity. So this maybe temptation to make Christ sort of in a certain image that might be more palatable to people. So those were some of the themes that I think came out of the story.
That makes a lot of sense. And it is, to say the least, a concerning idea, right? That a virtual entity that does not have, let's say, life or humanity somehow is making claims, godlike claims. But what if that creates a connection with humans? So yeah, no, it's that's the whole point of the story, is to put us in those positions and see where that would go. And then just a follow-up to this question, considering that our theme this month at AI Faith is on AI uses for ministry specifically, what do you hope religious leaders would take away from your story?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that there's a specific moral other than to kind of think about the second and third and fourth order effects. I think that these technologies are very likely to be a bigger and bigger part of our lives as we go forward. People who are responsible for various kinds of ministries, I hope that they're really thinking about both the benefits and the burdens of these technologies and really being wise about how they're implemented.
If you don't mind me asking, what is kind of your religious background, and was that at all kind of made its way into the story?
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian denomination. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so growing up in a Christian faith, I think that you understand how Christianity permeates kind of every part of your life. And, considering how technology changes, I think it adds interesting questions about what worship is and might be like in the future.
Well, let's switch now to Shannon. So Shannon, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Right. Thanks for having me today. My name is Shannon Betcher, and like Chris, I've been working in technology for a big part of my life. For about 30 years, I've worked on various products, building products and managing people who build products at companies like Netscape and Microsoft. Back in 2016, I left that career and focused on raising my boys, and also went back to school. And I did a PhD that focused on how AI might intersect with spirituality. And this is when I got involved with AI and faith. And in a much more simple form, I designed some experiences that people used with their phones and SMS texting back and forth with chatbots that represented authority in their different religious faiths. Used home voice assistants like Alexa and Google Home. I used computers and sort of like a chat GPT-like interface for people to interact. And mine was a study that went across faiths. So I had 5 major faith traditions as well as non-religious people interact in this way. And so in some ways, it was similar to some of Chris's ideas, but implemented in a very prosaic form and very, just some early ideas. And of course, this was a few years before ChatGPT, and some of the ideas were still pretty early on. But the focus was really on some of the things that Chris talked about, like how do people interact with these kinds of experiences? What do they mean to them? How does it affect their faith and their outlook in life? And so that's been the work that got me connected with AI and faith, and then finished my PhD about a year ago. And I've been working as an ethicist for a large language model company, doing some of this work in practice around policy and ethics on how we're implementing the technology in the world.
This is great. And I love how this kind of the lines between fiction and nonfiction start blurring, both from the work that both of you do, right? And the story and even some of the research that you're doing. So in your analysis, so of course, Shannon is here because he wrote kind of a response to Chris' story in the book, and it's kind of an analytical, what we call an analytical essay. In your essay, you introduce the 4 voices of theological reflection. Can you briefly describe what they are and why you chose that as a framework to analyze the story?
This is a framework that really looks at the combination of factors that affect people's spirituality, how they form their view, their spiritual worldview, and how they interact in the world. And so this is Helen Cameron's work. It's work that I got introduced to as part of my doctoral research. And the framework really just it's 4 voices, the normative, formal, espoused, and operant voices. And really, to simplify it, and it's a little bit risky to do that, but to simplify it, it's the idea that there are some influences that come from a formal, structured or religion. So this could be sacred texts. It could be religious officials, priests, rabbis, imams, others that sort of lead you in your faith and in that tradition. And so by being part of a faith, you subscribe to a number of those things, right? Might be the sacred texts are the word of God, should be interpreted as such. There are also the instructions that you get from a religious official you might take as being very, very important, very meaningful to you. You should follow them, without question. Espoused and operant voices have to do with others in the community. So maybe more lay people that are in your community. How do they influence your view of how to practice your faith in the world, in real world interactions? And then an espoused voice is really one that is sort of, how do we think about ourselves in this mix, in this milieu of all of these different influences? And that is actually a very powerful one as well, is how do we internalize the very formal instructions that we get from texts and officials and people around us? And then how do we interact with people? How do we make decisions? How do we teach our children? What direction do we go? Left or right when we've got a big decision to make. That framework is helpful when we're thinking about a new way of practicing faith or a new tool or a technology. And very often scholars will use this framework to question, hey, is there a 5th voice? And is this some new thing that we haven't really considered before? Or is this really a tool through which these other voices are being spoken? And so that's where I found the utility in exploring the kiosk and what it meant, but also thinking about some of the things that Chris had mentioned, the authority and where do we place authority, and what happens if the kiosk makes a promise to you, about something, or gives you an instruction to act. How should you interpret that? And then, of course, it calls into questions the ethics of who's making those decisions about what the kiosk will do and how it will say, what directions it will give. And so these are all threads that start to become exposed as you start, drilling into this. And I thought the 4 voices is an interesting framework to say, hey, where would this kiosk, where would it live, among the voices, and where is it likely to be? Like, who's controlling the kiosk and what it does, and then how do people feel about it in the world? So that's a little bit of a early primer on the 4 voices and why I selected them here.
The way you're describing it feels a little bit that maybe the kiosk and the Jesus AI is a bit like a relic, right? So if we think on the Catholic tradition, the role of relics, and of course there are in other religions, there is the sense that the relic is, let's say, a piece of cloth, or it may be a piece of wood from the cross, and that object carries not necessarily authority, but the power to do miracles because it is connected to a figure of faith. So pieces of the cross are connected to Jesus, and now you can look at that and then you can ask. So it's almost like a point of access. I'm wondering if maybe that is even though not fully adequate, but maybe a parallel here that maybe the Jesus kiosk could be maybe serve a function as a relic, right? It's an object that carries spiritual meaning and power because of its connection with a religious figure. So what are your thoughts, either one of you, on that?
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting way to look at it. For a lot of people, I think it could definitely be that instrument or that tool that could bring them closer to the divine. I think there's this question of kind of control in a sense. Typically, a relic is something that can't speak to you or tell you to do something that doesn't have a programming. And so when you introduce that other layer, it adds, I think, some interesting complications.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think the relic is something, that carries authority for people of a faith and who believe in that, and so I think there's definitely a tie there, with the kiosk. With the kiosk, I also thought a little bit about the space and physical space of what it is. And if you think about the way that religious spaces are often created, they often reflect the sort of lower level or deep meaning within a given religion. So, often a cathedral will be in the shape of a cross, and you'll have an altar that's raised, and there's a person of authority on the altar, and people are in the pews or they're kneeling. There's some form of hierarchy that's just built into the way that the church is set up and in the way that communication is expected to flow in that environment. Or you might be in an ashram, people are sitting on the floor all together. That's a different kind of a setup, and in terms of the space. And these things are very intentional in religions. It's no mistake that cathedrals look like cathedrals and synagogues look like synagogues and all the like, and Quaker meeting places look like they look. And so when I thought about the kiosk in particular, I thought about how is that space constructed and what does that feel like to be in? And I thought a big part of the utility of the kiosk over like the experiences that I built, which were people just using their own personal devices to interact, was that it was a space that you went to and it was a space that you were in. You were also alone in this space, I think, generally, Chris. I don't know if you thought about more than one person being in them, but that's also really important too, because when people are alone and if they have a sense of privacy, and this is something that came out in my research as well, if they have a sense of privacy in this interaction, there is another kind of layer available. Like they'll go deeper in terms of how they're connecting and disclosing information and seeking advice if they feel like they're not subject to social interaction where they might be judged by a peer or even a religious official. And so these are all things that I thought about in the kiosk is like, what if a church decided, like many companies, to go fully remote? Would the kiosk be an important part of that still? Because you would want a place for someone to go that wasn't their home, that wasn't their car, but represented the organization in some way. And so these are just some of the ideas that came to me that are related to like this idea of relic or space and the design of it.
Let me go even a little deeper on that, because yes, there was a physical space, right, which is your place you go, a bit of a private place. I guess there's a door to close. There's like you are quiet and you are there experiencing this. But then there is this augmented reality and virtual reality, right? So now it's no longer just a physical space. It is also a, for lack of a better word, cyberspace. So when we start talking about, let's say, holy cyberspaces, what are some things that maybe we gain and maybe some things that we lose with these holy cyberspaces?
One of the questions that would be raised is around community and how much of a force that is in the ritual, the community around you. I mean, I suppose you could go all the way and say, hey, you couldn't differentiate between the real and the cyber. I suppose many people could be together, from multiple kiosks at a time, right? Doing something there. It's certainly what could be gained is the ability to go anywhere, just like in the story, people were traveling to the Holy Land or looking, they were able to go and experience things that they wouldn't ever be able to do otherwise. There's that big element of it. And then I think the questions about, for me, that maybe would be more on the downside are the ones about community and face-to-face interactions and what's lost there. The same kinds of questions that people have about all the Zoom meetings and being remote, like, is it the same as really being there? And maybe there's some combination of the two things, that people get together once a quarter, or on big holidays, and then they practice otherwise in their kiosks. And so maybe there's a good blend that could be had there. I think it's interesting in the story too, though, how many people interact with Pablo, and while he's fixing things, and like he in a sense becomes a bit of a religious official, sort of accidentally, maybe. And so there's, Chris can speak to that more. It seemed like that was really important, as far as like going to the kiosk was one thing, but seeing him was another part of the experience as well.
What's funny is I don't know that I really thought of him as a evangelist until I read that article, and he absolutely is. He's facilitating people's experiences. And I think in a lot of ways, maybe he himself doesn't appreciate kind of the role that he has in helping bring people to this machine. And that's clearly on display with his relationship with his mom.
Mm-hmm. And I think his privileged knowledge of the ins and outs of that machine and what goes into it. But yeah, this idea of the unintentional clergy, unintentional priest technologist, right, who is just there to fix things, but somehow becomes more than that. So I think I would offer that as a reflection to all tech workers like ourselves here and others listening, that maybe some of the work we're doing is not just bits and bytes, and possibly there's something else to it, especially as more and more people are impacted by it. Maybe there's a spiritual dimension in silicon that we never explored. So I'll just leave that thought out there, let it float. Now, I do want to, part of the story that was interesting was an implicit critique of the limitations of commercializing spiritual experiences. You start hitting some boundaries, and there are multiple stakeholders asking questions. And of course, there is the desire and the goal to optimize profit and all of these things. I wonder, and this is for both of you, what are maybe some lessons or reflections that tech companies, religious or otherwise, right? We're seeing now kind of a religious tech industry starting to come up. You will see more and more in that, but they don't necessarily have to be a religious tech company. But what can they learn early on from your story?
We often, I think, approach this question in terms of technology,
mm-hmm.
but really, I think it's a question of business model. And Shannon's article talks a little bit about this. If the business model is to sell ads, that introduces some interesting problems. Imagine, this Jesus giving you a lecture and then pausing to tell you how great the blooming onions are at Outback. Or imagine another one, that business model that's based on selling user data. Imagine someone asking for a miracle and then getting a bunch of ads for fishy looking vitamins that purport to heal the same ailment that you have. So I think the real question is maybe not one of technology, but one of what's the model for making money, and what kind of incentives does that create?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And logical question on any of these kinds of technologies that a religious organization might consider building, or if a technology company is building it, of course, is about how many people are using it. Like that'll be the very first thing that they're trying to track way before revenue even. Then it becomes how do you keep it growing? How do we generate revenue? And that's where I think these business model questions start to crop up. And we just have to be, I think, very clear-minded about like what is driving the adoption of these technologies, and what are the goals of those companies. And I think advertising being the thing would be, I think, very problematic. I agree with Chris. I think there's also, again, like anytime you design a technology and you connect with this idea of it being religious in some way, or a reference point for religion in some way, you start to grapple with this authority. Like we already defer the internet and to technology in general. We're all old enough to remember when we capitalized the word internet, because of our respect for its power, and that's changed. But people and this has been studied, there is a space that people enter when they put themselves in front of technology that is one of deference typically. Hey, if we're disagreeing about a fact, or we're wondering about something, we look it up and Google settles it right for us. And so we defer in many ways to the answers that we get back. And so that carries over, particularly when you say, hey, this is a Jesus chatbot or this is a Bible chatbot. Like, people are expecting that it's been vetted. It's the answers that it's giving are truly authoritative. So there are multiple things, the technology itself, our experience with using technology, and especially connected technology, and then mix that in with the way that authority works in religions, and you have a cocktail that is very focused on, or is very likely to end up in a place where people are deferring and trusting and believing in the information that they're receiving through these kinds of products. And so that's just a responsibility, even if you're not doing a religious product, like it's a responsibility that large language model vendors have and every large technology provider has. But it certainly would be a major factor here.
To add to your comments, both of you, I think there might be a role for independent agencies to audit and to check on those things. I think there's a problem when you have a company that is so global, that is in 1 billion homes, right? One is centralization of power, but second, even if that company wants to do their job and are, want to monitor, make sure nothing goes wrong, can they really do it, right? And so how do you maybe distribute that to communities a little more, and possibly religious communities could play a role in that, since we've been dealing with this issue of authority for so many centuries. Well, great conversation. I wanted to give both of you a chance to provide any final comment.
I mean, I want to thank Chris for writing this story. I think science fiction is one of the great beauties of it is that it makes us think about the future and stretch our minds in terms of what is possible and what is coming and what are the implications for that. And I certainly think that Repairman did that for me. I felt a strong connection to the story, and based on a lot of the research and the work that I did, and so it was really enjoyable to have a chance to read it in depth and to reflect on it. And I think it's a great story for people of religious backgrounds, people in positions of a religious authority, to read and really think about the implications of this technology that's coming, how they might play a role in what technologies are distributed and used by their flocks, and also how to characterize its use, from other sources. So I think it was really enjoyable, and thanks, Chris, for doing it.
Thank you. I absolutely enjoyed reading your article. I feel like this sort of the technology issues that my story touched on, were you can only do so much in a short story. And your article was very expansive in considering other things. I just absolutely loved reading it. And like you said, that's the joy of science fiction, is being able to imagine what the future might be, because really we're forming the future now every day. And so it's fun to think about what might happen. It's scary sometimes to think about what might happen, but I think it's an imperative on all of us to think about it.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, that is the point of this anthology, and this story and the essay really illustrates this well.
You can find Repairman and the companion essay in our recently released book, Faithful AI, Stories of Hope from 2045, available at Amazon. Check out our previous interview with contributors Julian Drayman and Dr. Brian Green on AI and identity in the Global South. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite platform and share it with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We are on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.